Vince Molinaro, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dwayne. Looking forward to the conversation.
So I've looked at your LinkedIn, and the LinkedIn doesn't tell the full story. Your LinkedIn tells a lot. I can tell you that as I'm going through it. I'm like, wow, you have seen things. But please tell, for those who don't know you that well, tell us your story.
Well, the LinkedIn profile is long because I've been around a while. Yeah, so I currently run a company called Leadership Contracting. It's my business that I started back in January of 2019. We focus on really providing support and development for leaders when their companies are going through a significant transformation or strategic shift. And what we have found in those moments is the expectations of leaders increase dramatically. And we help them understand what those expectations are and really step up to them and be accountable in how they work together to lead the organization. And we do that through a number of ways. But that's what LCI is about. I also am an author. I've written several books. I have a new one coming out in February called Leading Strategic Shifts. And we've done a number uh, of research studies in our own independent research. And so the thought leadership and the research is foundational to everything that we do. In terms of the broader story, kind of how I got into the training space, it happened really early in my career. I was working for a large public sector organization that did really important work. We helped the neediest people in our society get their lives back on track, either through education, financial assistance, giving them access to jobs, and whatnot. And the role I had gave me an opportunity to start doing workshops, which I really enjoyed, and at the time thought I was probably needing of more training in training, so did a certificate in training and development through a local university, and that was a great experience. One of the facilitators was an independent trainer who told me of this wonderful world he had where he had number of clients, had billable days, and it sounded kind of compelling to me because I didn't realize at the time that I was actually an entrepreneur at heart. And after spending 4 years with that organization, I left it to start my own business that focused primarily on career counseling and training. And then that went well, but after I felt like I needed more academic training. So I did, while I ran my business, did a master's in adult education, and then did a PhD where I focused on curriculum and did research on what I called sort of holistic approaches to leadership. And so from that moment in time, leadership and leadership development was always the thing I focused on, and I did that through various other roles, either going in companies or larger consulting companies. I've also, like, I lead businesses. So I think the other advantage that my team and I bring is we're not strictly academics. We practice what we preach. I know what it feels like to own payroll, own a P&L, and I think that translates into differences when we're working with leaders and managers.
So you were starting a business, running a business, and then said, I don't have enough going on. Let's see if I can get a master's degree at the same time. Well, that was possible. What about a doctorate? And I hear that and I'm like, I'm having enough trouble just keeping things organized in my own world without then saying, let me see what more I can put on top of that. How did you manage all that? Is
Well,
that
the,
is
the
that part of what you teach now? Because I imagine people hear that and they're like, tell me your secrets.
well, well, actually, some of the insight came many years later when I did the Clifton Strengths for the first time and found, if you know that that
Mhm.
assessment tool, um, achiever was my number one strength. So
Yeah.
so and that also means not just accomplishing things, getting them done. So results are really important. I didn't realize it then, but I've always, whether it was high school or my time in university, I've always pursued the topics that interest me. So I think that was the starting point. And I never really had sights on a PhD, but when I did the master's, an advisor I had encouraged me to pursue the PhD. And she said, listen, you've already organized your life on running your business, and and kind of doing graduate work, your PhD is going to be pretty much more of the same. So, if you stop and do it somewhere down the road, it's just going to be that much harder to get going. And as things played out, as I looked in the opportunities, they presented themselves, and I went for it. So, I've learned in my career there are times when people will come to you and give you things to think about that become really valuable that you would not even thought about it for yourself. And I've always found that if people are willing to go out of their way to help you, at least I need to follow up and take some actions and see where things go. So it's not that it happened by accident by any stretch of the imagination, but it also, I was encouraged to do that, and it largely worked for me. Was it
It
challenging? Yeah, I mean, when I was finally done my thesis defense and I was absolutely done my PhD, I remember walking feeling lighter, and this big cloud that hung over me was kind of off my back.
it reminds me of 2 separate learning experiences from my life, and the first one was I was working with residential I was working at a residential treatment facility for adjudicated youth, and I was talking to one of their counselors, and I was talking about whether I wanted to go to college or not. I was out of the Navy, and I
Mhm.
said to her, "You know, by the time I get done, I'll be 30." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, don't you plan on being 30 anyway?" And I said, "Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point." And then, another instance, you talked about the fact that, you already had your life structured in a way working on the master's that the PhD would just be a continuation of that, and it reminded me of going hiking with the scouts. When I was hiking in the mountains with the scouts, the guide said, "Look, if you're on the upward track,
Yeah,
you keep going. If you're coming down the hill, you step to the side for those coming up because it's a lot easier to stop going downhill and then continue than it is to be going uphill, stop and start again." And that's
right.
kind of the same mindset, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's cool. That's a cool insight.
So tell me about the leadership contract, what you taught at ATD. Why strong cultures have clear leadership expectations.
Yeah, well, it kind of, part of my story is as a trainer and consultant and business person, um, I was always kind of brought into organizations, or they reached out to my team and I whenever they were, facing something significant. They use different terms for it. We're at a existential crisis as a company, or we're at an inflection point, or we need to take a strategic pivot, or whatever. Now I'm seeing the language as a strategic shift. It's pretty common. And coming out of the great financial crisis, um, I started to notice a common problem that a lot of the executives were expressing, and it was essentially we're investing in the development of our leaders, but we're not seeing it translate into better leadership, and we don't know what's going on. And that was kind of intriguing because when you kind of do work as an external, it is quite surprising how when you hear a new problem surface in one organization, 2 days later you're talking to another organization and they start expressing the exact same problem. And then there's a pattern. And so that's what we began to see. So I kind of sat there going, well, what is missing in the world of leadership development that we haven't figured out yet? And I thought hard about it. And this idea of a contract came to mind, a leadership contract, because what I found was that, most organizations, and it still happens today, when you ask leaders, how did you first get into a managerial or a leadership role? And I've asked this question around the world. It is surprising how many times they say, well, if I'm going to be honest, I got in by accident. I was really good at something, right? I was the best engineer. I was the best business analyst. I was the best accountant. I was the best whatever technical area of expertise you're good at. Your performance stands out relative to the rest of employees. And we've had a history of going to those people to say, you're so good at this thing, we're now going to give you this other job. Completely different. We'll give you a cool title. We'll pay you a little more. We probably won't support you in any development. Good luck with that.
Very often you'll hear that situation and the new title they get is trainer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Same scenario, but
Yeah,
please
for
go ahead.
sure. Yeah, yeah. So anyhow, And so what I learned through my own experience is that whenever you take on a leadership role, you actually do sign up for something important. We just haven't done a great enough job of making that explicit. Now, some leaders are astute enough and smart enough to figure out what that is, or maybe their organization does a deliberate job of doing that for them. But I can tell you my experience that that's the exception, and that the rule of the day is most leaders are left figuring it out on their own, and makes what is already a demanding role far more challenging than it needs to be. So the leadership contract says there is a contract, and like any contract, it comes with a set of four terms and conditions. And the first one is it is a decision that you deliberately have to make. You can't go into it by accident. You can't be ambivalent. You're going to be asked to do some challenging things, and you got to be clear that you're up for the task. And two, it comes with obligation, the obligation to leave your company in better shape than you found it, to invest in the development of your people, to create value for customers. Third, it's a lot of hard work, and you need to have the courage and resolve to tackle it. What we find is a lot of leaders avoid the hard work, or particularly around difficult conversations, giving candid feedback, and they don't appreciate that when they avoid the hard work, they weaken themselves, weaken their teams, and weaken the organization. And finally, the fourth term is that it's about a community, that increasingly leadership isn't going to rest on the shoulders of one individual. How great they may be, or even how great an executive team may be in today's world with all the complexity, as you know, Dwayne, it's not enough. We need every leader, every manager, in every role working together. And so I wrote a book called The Leadership Contract. As soon as the book came out, it really resonated immediately. And what really was kind of an analogy I had is, the contract always has always been there, but a lot of us have treated it like an online contract. When you're kind of
Just
online
scroll through it
conducting
and
some,
click at
you
the
just
end.
scroll down to the bottom, you click agree. You haven't read any words on that contract, but you kind of know you're bound to something. You're not entirely sure what that is, right? And I always like joking, saying I hope that one day I don't get a knock at the door and Apple or Microsoft or Netflix comes to my front door taking away my kids and my dog because I missed something in that online contract. So that's kind of the analogy, and that became a foundation of the work that I did. And then because we saw this as a real problem that a lot of organizations were facing, we started doing some of our own research. We partnered with the executive branch of SHRM for our first research report, and that just validated everything we were seeing anecdotally. And then after a few years of bringing those ideas into organizations, that was really a strong message of accountability and what does it mean to be an accountable leader at the individual level. Organizations said, this is great for individual aspects of accountability. But the challenge that we're seeing now is leaders are struggling driving accountability within their teams. And where they really struggle is what I call shared accountability. So you and I are in different teams, different departments. We're on the hook for the same strategic priority. You own part of it, I own part of it. And we've got to kind of get together to figure that out. And that's a murky world for a lot of leaders. So that inspired the book Accountable Leaders, which came out in June of 2020 as the pandemic was heating up. And that book found an audience somehow without a book launch, without any of the things that authors typically do, because we couldn't at the time. And then in the fall of 2024, I launched Community of Leaders, which was really like, how do we now scale accountability at every level in the organization among leaders? And that's what that book was about. So in many ways, my work is always about solving the toughest leadership problems that organizations face and providing them a practical, proven research kind of oriented way in how to do that.
Let me One thing I was thinking about was when I was in my last role, we I was in charge of onboarding, orientation, that sort of thing. And I really fell in love with the idea. It was new to me, might not be new to training, but it was this idea of everboarding. So you have
Mm,
orientation, onboarding, and then everboarding. And we started working on the idea that you should have onboarding every time you get a new role, every time you get a
yeah,
promotion, there should be
absolutely.
onboarding. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about, this
Yeah,
commitment?
yeah, absolutely. So we call it, have identified sort of 4 turning points where that kind of onboarding is most critical. So the first time you become a manager, or a team lead is a significant turning point because, you were an individual contributor, largely responsible for your own performance, and you got rewarded based on what you did. Now you are responsible for a team, and now you're measured differently, and you have different responsibilities and expectations, and that is a shift for a lot of people. So that I think uh, completely agree with you. The next one is when you become kind of that middle manager, because being in the at that mid level, it's a completely different leadership task. It's more enterprise wide. You're on the hook. And you got greater pressure and scrutiny on you from leaders above. And the first time you become an executive, that's another one. But before any of that even happens, is it's even the very first time you get tapped on the shoulder and someone says, we think you've got some leadership potential in you. I remember when that happened early in my career, when a senior leader who wasn't even my manager kind of took me under her wing. She was sort of a mentor to me, and in a meeting she said, "You need to be in management." And I didn't even know what that meant. I was like 23, 24 years old, didn't really know what that meant. I had a sense of what they did. They seemed to always spend all their days in meetings, but and so I remember thinking of, okay, so what is she seeing in me? What do I need to do to prepare and to get ready? So those are sort of the turning points that kind of onboarding that you speak about is most critical.
When you are thinking about this, I think about this just from a training perspective because that's where a lot of my focus is, and a lot of the listeners of the podcast are trainers. When you think about the strong culture and clear leadership expectation, what is learning and development's role in that?
Well, learning and development clearly plays a role, and can play a role, depending on the organization, in shaping those expectations and helping the organization to define what those expectations are, right? Now, in some organization, that could be done by another group in HR, but ultimately, when you have them, they should be foundational for everything that's built from a training and leadership development standpoint, in my opinion. Um, because when you do that, you help leaders kind of connect the dots between the expectations and the skills and capabilities they need to learn, aligned with those expectations. So I think that's number one. The other thing I've learned is sometimes, less so now, but certainly when I was kind of, growing up as a trainer, it was all about, learning objectives and all that kind of stuff. And it was all about the learning of the individual. And we're seeing increasingly in the leadership space, and it gets back to this idea of leadership as a community, is that how can we create training and learning that not only, imparts skills and capabilities, but also strengthens the culture. And that I think is a wide open opportunity for a lot of trainers that they may haven't thought about. And then the other part is really knowing the business, right? Years ago, I spoke to an audience of trainers talking about, you got to understand the business contexts and the strategy of the organization, because that informs the expectations of leaders and managers, which then informs what you need to do as a trainer. And someone said, "Oh, I never thought of that." In fact, she goes, "Every week there's an operations meeting in the meeting room next to where my workstation is." And I said, "You better get yourself into that meeting
Mhm.
because that's where you learn about what the business problems are, what the challenges are, and that will inform what you've got to build from a training standpoint."
One thing I was thinking about also was there are opportunities here for trainers to recognize where the culture maybe isn't as strong.
Yeah,
And I think that we have all read the studies and the data that look, people are more willing to stick with an organization when that organization invests in them. And so for
absolutely.
learning and development to come up and say, "Hey, look, we see an area here, there's a gap. What we'd like to do is XYZ," and bring in these these ideas that you're
Yeah,
talking about and pitch those. That not only helps the organization, but it also helps the learning and development department because we
yeah.
all know that when it comes crunch time, they're going to start looking around for who's creating value. You better be able to show you are.
Well, and that's the heart of it, from my perspective, right? It's what's the strategic, um, what's the strategic value that learning professionals can provide? And I think it goes beyond just, making sure we're clear on leadership expectations or creating complex competency models or that kind of stuff. Those things are important. I'm not saying they're not. But I think it's if you start asking where's the opportunity for us to create strategic value that moves the business forward, it's a different set of questions. It's a different starting point. Now, sometimes you might be limited because, your organization may have a more traditional view of what training does. I mean, I was in a pharmaceutical company where I headed up the learning and leadership function, and it was a startup. The parent company was in Germany. They started up a business in Canada with the intent of expanding into the US. So we had to build my team and I had to build everything from scratch, right? And so we built all the nuts and bolts things that we needed. The sales training and training of clinical and all that kind of stuff. And then I was saying, okay, now we're ready to go after the real cool things, change, OD, all those sorts of things that are about strategic value. And everyone said, no, just keep doing what you're doing. This is great. You're doing great. Just keep doing what you're doing. I said, no, that's not why I'm here. And I realized that I'm not a maintainer. I'm a builder, and I need to always be building. Now, some people are great maintainers, and I decided I needed to leave that organization so they can bring in what they needed, which was a maintainer, so I can go off and do the next phase of my work. And that's when I went back into consulting.
I believe I'm trying to remember, but I think I scored as a builder also. So,
Yeah, and you gotta know that about yourself.
yeah.
Neither is good or bad. It's just, where you're at, where you're gonna add the best value. I always feel that's the one of the first questions that we need to ask ourselves. Right.
Yeah. So if you're in an organization and you're listening to this and you're like, Vince, that sounds great and all, but I don't exactly have a strong culture at work. How can they take what we're talking about here, these clear leadership expectations, and start working them in to build that culture up? What advice would you give someone who's hearing this, wants to make a change, but isn't sure how to get started?
Well, the good news is, particularly if the training is tied to leaders, right? It's in making sure that in the programs you're having the conversation around culture with the leaders, right? Because ultimately, sometimes my experience is um, some senior leaders think of culture as this amorphous thing. They can't kind of measure it, track it. Can't, they often, once one executive described it to me as like a bowl of jello, right? It's this jiggly thing that I don't know what to do with it, right? But we know all the research, Gallup has shown, the impact, and others have shown the impact of leadership on engagement. If you go back to Edgar Schein's early work on ultimately it's leaders who create culture in the way they behave every single day. Well, guess what? Trainers have a lot of influence on how leaders behave. So that would be, I wouldn't be coming at it through this culture is this big amorphous thing. I'd be coming at it very practically, which is behaviors drive culture. Let's make sure we're helping leaders and managers develop the behaviors they need to create the best culture we can create, and then you just chip away and you keep going at it and you build a bit of a critical mass. And that so I think it's my nature is to be highly pragmatic. It's a more pragmatic way of doing it. And then to change a whole culture of 100,000 employees might be hard, but you can have impact where you live, and you can get your gratification from seeing the light bulbs come up from leaders, to see leaders doing exceptional things with their teams. And I can tell you when that happens, everyone else notices, right? If I'm sitting over here on a team where the culture isn't great and I look over there and I go, why are they having so much fun? Why are they hitting it out of the park on their numbers? Everyone gets curious, right? So I think sometimes we may underestimate the kind of impact we can have, but it may not necessarily come from a grand sweeping degree of impact. It can be like those daily base hits that build up over time, and then eventually there's a triple and if you're lucky, a grand slam every once in a while. to
when
use
you
a
talked
baseball
about
analogy. Sorry.
sorry, when you talked about the leader talking about culture being like Jello,
Yeah.
I thought to myself, "Well, who set the mold?" You know,
Yeah.
who set the mold for that Jello? Because it's gotta look like something. It's either a plain bowl or you put it in something nice, and who set that? And
Yeah.
I don't know why my mind went there, but that's just what
Well,
I
and
thought.
it's a great point. It's exactly that, right? Leaders should set the mold, but that means they've got to value culture. They've got to understand how it drives performance. And if they don't, then they're not even thinking about the mold,
Yeah,
right?
and
Because it's different to,
they gotta
yeah,
realize that they said it. I mean, they're the ones that decide that. Even in their
absolutely.
inaction, they are deciding what kind of culture they have.
Absolutely. Well, what that means when we do work on helping an organization define a set of leadership expectations, what we have found is that, if we go off and be too much HR or training purists and using jargony language, it doesn't land anywhere, right? Nobody gets it. So you got to write things in very simple, accessible ways in the way that the organization speaks, and defining it into 4 or 5 expectations at most, and defining why they're important to the business. And then you got to define what do the behaviors look like against each of those. And a lot of organizations I found when they've done that themselves, they do that. Identify expectations, identify the desired behaviors. What we do, what we've learned you also have to do, and what most don't, is you also have to define the behaviors you won't tolerate, because and what you will not expect, not accept, right? So it's really, what do we expect and what we will not tolerate, because when it comes to culture, right, when a culture gets eroded, it's a lot of the misaligned behaviors that are being demonstrated. And so, in full transparency, it's important to make it really clear to people, here are the expectations, here are the behaviors that are desired and are aligned with our expectations, and these are the misaligned behaviors. And if you're demonstrating too many of these behaviors, someone's going to be having a conversation with you.
There was a book I read, and I'm sure it's over there somewhere. I can't see it with my reading glasses on, but I know it's there. And the name of it escapes me. But they talked about also having a shared vision, and
Yep.
what blew my mind about that was this idea. I'd always thought when you have a shared vision, it's like this. Okay, Vince, I know the company vision. You're new here. I'm going to tell you the company vision. Now we have a shared vision, and that's not at all what this book was saying. What this book was saying was that we have a vision and we help you see that working with us helps you accomplish your own personal vision for what
Yeah.
you want as well. So it's not that you're invested in what we want to do, it's that by working with us, you're also doing what you want to see, the good you want to see in the world too.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds like the work of Peter Senge in the Fifth Discipline, right?
That's it. I was sitting there going,
Yeah.
it was the fifth something. What was it? Yeah, building a learning organization. That's exactly the
Absolutely.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Um, I don't know why my mind went there, but it just did. Look, we got a few minutes
Well, I
left.
think
Just
I think your point is tied to that kind of, perpetual onboarding, right? I think we underestimate how long it takes time for people to understand, internalize a lot of these things, right? It's not going to happen in a 30-minute webinar, right? A good example is I see the parallels with strategic clarity, right? So for us, when we talk about a strong community of accountable leaders, the number one characteristic that our research finds is that there's absolute clarity on the strategic direction of the organization. But if you've worked with, if you work with CEOs, and we worked with a ton of them, you want to see what really gets them really upset really quickly is when they just finish their roadshow going around talking about the strategy, and then they get feedback, excuse me, but no one understands the strategy, and they're going, well, why don't they? Well, because what we have found is they think that communicating strategy, like communicating culture, is about communication. It's a communication task. So, like you said, it comes from me. Now, what often happens is, because CEOs are always speaking to investors, to the board, to analysts, they're using language for that audience, and they use that language to their internal audience. And let's be honest, most employees, most managers aren't steeped in financial discipline, aren't steeped in financial lingo. So we ran a session for a group of 300 leaders, as a good example, and we had, I think, all the way to mid-level, and at the mid-level, they were real operators, right? Heads down, just getting the work done, and, of course, there was a panel, and the panel of executives talked about the strategy, and they were using terms like earnings per share and EBITDA and on and on and on, and then we did a polling component, and the first question that came up was, "What is EBITDA?" And they were blown away by it. They had never thought that a leader 4 levels down would not know that. Well, then when we said, "Well, why would you expect that they would know that?" Because they're deep in operations in this manufacturing environment, they don't need to know what that means. But you're talking about your strategy through that language, they're never gonna get it. And so I always say, whether it's strategy or culture, it's about a translation. It's not communication. You need to translate the strategy for your intended audience.
That's a great story. Thank you. I there's a lot there that I'm gonna be thinking about after this, but we've actually reached the end of the time. What I wanna give you now is the opportunity. If people have heard this and they say, "Look, I wanna work with Vince," how can they get a hold of you?
Well, our website is leadwithlci.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can kind of reach out there. Those are the two simplest ways to reach out. All the books are, you can get information on our website or on Amazon. And as I said, the newest book will be coming out in February called Leading Strategic Shifts. And that really is about understanding the 9 DNA behaviors that leaders need to really embrace when their organization is going through fundamental transformation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Vince. I appreciate you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Dwayne. Great chat.